Hello, BookTube. Just recently, Britt, whose channel you should all subscribe to if you don't already, made a video that I'm certain has every Raven boy out there trembling. A video that they probably never thought she'd make. She made a video wondering if she's growing out of YA. And Miriam, at her blog, Between Lines and Life, did a response of her own that was really good. It wasn't a YouTube video, but it was a further rumination on the subject of YA, which is, of course, the central subject of BookTube, as BookTube has been known so far. And it reminded me, the two of them, the combination together, reminded me that I have seen other videos in 2017 and even in the latter half of 2017 where people confess something along the same lines, thoughts and misgivings about the genre that built BookTube. And that got me ruminating on the sins of YA, the reason why it might be falling out of grace with so many people. And that means it's clearly time for YA to squeeze itself into the confessional box and have a little talk with Father Donahue. I'll talk about what I'm going to call the 7 deadly sins of YA. Starting with number 1, which is gluttony. And we've all seen that. The gluttony that YA induces in the people who follow it exclusively, right? They need the bookshelves behind them. They need the lighting. They need the color schemes. They need the complete sets. They become gluttonous for these things to the exclusion of actual thought or examination of the contents. So gluttony is definitely involved. The second deadly sin here is lust. And that comes into play not only figuratively in terms of connected with gluttony, the lusting after these things, the lusting after the prettiest variant cover or the much sought after review copy. It's not only figuratively, it's also literally. Because when you think about it, there's no genre that I know of that is more thoroughly motivated, moved, and characterized by lust than YA. Not even romance. In many romance novels, the character motivations are greed, snobbery, desire to be left alone. But think how many YA stories you have read where the whole thing basically turns on lust, and that's understandable because it's this is a genre that's about teenagers and pitched to teenagers who are encountering feelings of strong emotions and hormones for the first time. And that's why it absolutely saturates, lust absolutely saturates YA in a way, to an extent, that makes it sinful. It's an extreme excess, to the point where, as I've pointed out on this channel before, and in print many times, to the point where the fates of whole empires and entire races of beings are determined by which boy the girl prefers. An insane, absurd distortion of balance. Deadly sin number 3 is greed. And that also connects with gluttony and lust. They are connected. The greed is, I need these things. I need all of these things. I need them to look a certain way. I need the things I'm lacking. I need the numbers that I'm lacking, the volumes that I'm lacking. I'm greedy for them in a way that exceeds simply being eager to read their contents. But it's not just that. This is a touchy subject, so I won't dwell on it too much. But it's that kind of greed, especially when it comes to YA, that I believe gave rise to the proliferation of subscription series and sponsorships on BookTube, of course. If a YA publisher comes to you, and of course it's not Rutgers University Press that's coming to BookTube and trolling around for sponsorships. It's YA publishers. If they come to you and offer you a deal, a contract to sign on the dotted line. If you will praise a certain book they've got coming out in the fall, and you sign that contract before you've even read the book, you are motivated by greed. And greed is bad, despite what you may have heard. So it's not only the greed for all of the books themselves, it's also the greed that has been baked into BookTube by the publishing industry, which has not missed the significance of the fact that so many booktubers command such large audiences talking about books written for a demographic 10 years younger than themselves. You've got, if you're in the book publishing business and you suddenly realize there's a whole cadre of publicity agents out there working for you already for free, you're going to co-opt them. And it's greed that will make them agree. And then deadly sin number 4 is pride. And this is also touchy because it's the environment that YA creates, the environment that it has grown up with, and the environment on which it thrives is the social justice warrior environment that has taken over college campuses and high schools and a lot of other communities in the last 10 years. If you go back before that movement started sweeping all opposition before it in places that used to value thought, you will see, I believe, a very different tenor in the YA literature that was being produced at the time. But it's completely different now. And the pride aspect extends to loathsome things that exist in the YA world now, like diversity coaches, like authenticity coaches, like you've got a manuscript, you've worked on it for 3 years, but you're being told by your publisher or your agent or whoever that you had better hire someone to read through it to see whether or not you got the people of a different ethnicity than you right. And they will tell you that, not based on their own literary merit, their own literary understanding of anything, because the ones that I've checked out don't have any, they don't read, but because they are that ethnicity. Think for a minute about how incredibly unhealthy that attitude is, how incredibly arrogant it is, how prideful it is for you to say, well, you have a Navajo in your story, and I am one-tenth Navajo, so I want you to pay me $150 an hour to tell you whether or not you got your Navajo character right, and whether or not you've written anything accidentally that may offend the Navajos. As if one person can speak for that, and as if it's any of their business whether you offend anyone or not. As if, for instance, assuming that it assumes that you don't want to offend anybody. The idea of that all of a sudden, because of the prevalence of the marriage of YA and the social justice warrior mentality distorted out of its true proportions, the idea that there are all these cops running around policing content and policing representation and policing own voices right down to its DNA is a prideful thing. If you were writing a YA novel that featured a fat old Boston Irish Catholic, and you came to me and said, can I pay you to make sure that I got this right? I would tell you, well, the first thing I would tell you I can't repeat on this channel. It comes straight from the heart of Southie. The second thing I would tell you is that I don't know what every single fat Irish Catholic Boston American feels and thinks, because they don't all think the same thing. It's an incredibly insulting and reducing thing to even assume such a thing. It's a prideful thing. It puts you in front of the literature. It suggests that the literature is there for you. That's, of course, not true. I feel strange even having to point that out, but that's, of course, not true. That's not why we have artists, to serve us. They serve their own inner demons and inner passions, and if we're lucky, they share it with us. Anyway, the deadly sin number 5 is despair. And it's a little thing here. In this particular case, nevertheless, though, you've all seen videos where someone is just in agony, rolling around on the floor sometimes when they're doing a skit, about how they they just can't stand to wait for the next book in a series, how there's nothing, the idea of a book hangover came originally from this. The idea that, well, now that I've finished this book, my life is just a gray wasteland until the next one comes out, and they're constantly refreshing Amazon to find out when that date is. That kind of despair is self-idolatry of the worst degree. So it's horrible to see it locked into literature. Sin number 6, my own personal favorite, is wrath. And it's the darkest and ugliest of the 7 deadly sins, and it was horrifying to me to see it appear in the world of reading, and yet it did, and it did so because of YA. No one thought to react to the way that Norman Mailer or Thomas Pynchon portrayed black people in their novels. No one thought to react to those portrayals in anything like the same way that whole organized mobs of people now routinely do for anything like that in the YA genre. The bullying of authors, the social media stalking of authors, the mobbing of authors on popular and very influential sites like Amazon or Goodreads, the mobbing of them with false reviews, with lying reviews, with reviews by people who admit they haven't read the book. If you haven't read a book and you write a review of it, you're lying, even if you praise it. But these authors, these people don't praise. They use that phenomenon and the mass effect of it, the fascism of it, specifically to bully authors into doing what they want. And that assembled anger, organized and pointed, is the very definition of wrath. And it's horrible, it's distorting, and it's very depressing to me how effective it's been. If you can get an author to grovel an apology on Twitter because they didn't include a character of the type that you want them to, as if it was your book that you were writing instead of theirs, then you are deep in the hinterlands of wrath. And you should seriously reconsider what you're doing. The first thing you should reconsider is whether or not you want reading as a hobby. Because reading in the world of the Republic of Letters would really like to see the back of you. If that's the way you are, that, this author clearly didn't hire a good enough sensitivity coach. Because, yes, her book has one black character and one lesbian character and one wheelchair-bound character, but it only has one of each, and so we're all of those groups are offended, and on and on and on and on and on. I saw a video by a very smart booktuber just the other day, and she listed a very short list of the things she looks for first in any new book that she encounters. The very first thing she listed was, does it have adequate representation, adequately diverse representation? And of course, the reason that she said adequate instead of good is because it's an infinite regress. It will never be good enough. It can only be adequate. And the second thing that she listed was, does it promote healthy attitudes? Now, I ask you, those two things, I don't even remember if literary quality or rhetorical brilliance or beauty of language, I don't even remember if any of those even made the list. Those were the top two. And I ask you, being sure that there's balance, equal number of boys and girls on either side of the tug of war, making sure that everyone's included, making sure that the fat kid or the crippled kid aren't simply left out, all those good things, and also making sure that healthy attitudes are promoted all the time, no matter what. I ask you, what do those two things remind you of? They remind you of school. High school, and they remind you of things that teachers do. Well, that's fine in high school, absolutely. And when I was a teacher, I made sure that those things happen. But in literature, in literature, you don't dictate those things. Literature does what it does, and if you don't like it, you go somewhere else. You read something else, or you read nothing at all. But to instead of doing those things, for the very first time in the history of reading, to instead opt for wrath. I read this book, and it had a blind character, and my brother is blind, and the blind character was portrayed in every stereotypical way imaginable. The blind character was saintly. The blind character had super sharp other senses, etc., etc. Really bothered me. I read that book and it really bothered me. It was a cheap and one-dimensional portrayal of what it's like to be blind. Okay, fine. That is actually an extremely valid criticism of a book. And totally your right to say as a reader. And for the last 2,700 years, that's what readers did. That's what they would do. They would talk to their friends. They would go to newspapers. They would, if they were a book reviewer, write it and say, this and this and this were good. But my God, what a simple, one-dimensional, boring, and insulting portrayal of blind people this book has. I'm sure that if you have been following book reviews at any length of time in any genre, you've seen how such a mention can really affect things, and authors learn from it. Okay, for 2,700 years, that was the policy, but not now. Not with YA. Not with the prevalence of YA and the marrying of it to social media. All of a sudden, wrath enters the picture. All of a sudden, you read that same book, and your reaction isn't, my God, that was one-dimensional. Boy, the author really dropped the ball on that part of his book. Instead, your reaction is, this portrayal of a blind person doesn't match at all the complexities and the challenges that I know they face because my brother's blind, and therefore I am angry, and I'm going to get a whole bunch of other people angry, and I'm going to get your book contract canceled. Unless, in your next book, you pay a blind person $200 to talk about what it's like to be blind, instead of imagining it, as is your job as a writer. I've gone on a little long with wrath. I said it was a problem. Of all the 7 deadly sins, it's the one to which I am most prone myself, and so most sensitive. And it gets at the heart of what is evil about the elevation of YA over all other kinds of genres. And you wouldn't even think about reacting in such a way to, I don't even know, to Thomas Mann? You wouldn't even think about it. And if you would, I'd rather you didn't. I'd rather you just leave reading, because it's not a fight you're going to win. But anyway, we'll go on to the last of the 7 deadly sins of YA, and that is sloth. And it's the last, and it's the easiest one, because it's the primary sin of the people who indulge in YA, adults who indulge in YA. I'm not at all here taking swipes at actual young adults. They are living in paradise in 2017 because they get to walk into a bookstore, a new retail bookstore, and find a YA section that, for all its trivialities and its redundancies, for all the love triangles and the insta-love and all of the stuff that very smart booktubers very rightly decry, for all of that, they're going to walk into a YA section, a section of books designed for them, and find a wealth of riches, the like of which no previous generation of young people has ever encountered in a bookstore. I remember vividly the days when, if a young person, let's say a 15-year-old, really wants to read, went into a retail bookstore, a bored clerk who really doesn't consider them a real person or a customer might half-heartedly recommend Treasure Island, but that was about it. Now, the plenitude, the variety is incredible. So I'm not at all swiping at those people when I talk about Sloth. I'm swiping at the people who I've been swiping with since pretty much my first video on BookTube. I'm swiping at the adults. The shaving, voting, driving, gin binging, coke snorting, armpit stinky adults. The 20, 30, and even 40-year-old adults on BookTube who have withdrawn into this little baby crib of this one genre and idolize it and idolatize it and read nothing else. Adults who read nothing else than a type of literature written for 15-year-olds. That is the epitome of sloth. And it has created on BookTube an unhealthy environment, an unhealthy atmosphere in which, as so many people point out, especially when they do how did I find BookTube videos of that sort, one sort or another, BookTube, I believe, the ethos of BookTube is shifting. As more and more readers come here from places like Goodreads, I believe that BookTube is I don't mean this to sound patronizing, but it is the most effective way for me to say it. I believe the booktube is growing up. And as that happens, you get more and more people who say, well, when I first got here, all of the people that were coming up in the search feed and in the suggestions sidebar were all of these people who were just, first of all, they were going nuts on camera, like they were spoon feeding themselves amphetamines. They're just bouncing all around in a way that seems insane. That genuinely does seem insane. Even genuine adult enthusiasm doesn't look like that. I don't know what that is. And not only that, but it working. Because you're acting like a clown you're acting like Hank Green on camera. You're spazzing out and nerding out in a way that is hyper theatrical and extremely fake. And it's getting you followers, which is getting you more and more AdSense revenue, which is getting you attention from publishers, which is getting you sponsorship deals, and a whole evil circle. That kind of greed and gluttony reinforces sloth, because all of a sudden you're living in this world. And the problem with sloth, there are many problems with sloth. I have big problems with sloth. I can't stand it. Because you only get this one time on Earth. This is it. This is all you get. This isn't, as David Brudno used to say, this is not a dress rehearsal. This is it. And if you... Anyway, I don't want to go off on a Father Donahue digression about the 7 deadly sins. I want to keep this concentrated on YA. And one of the horrible side effects of sloth when it comes to YA is something that a lot of people probably don't think might be applicable to them, but it is. I guarantee you that it is. And that is that after a while of this kind of sloth, you're incapable of correcting it, which is really serious. If you come into BookTube, you're suddenly getting massive amounts of hits and clicks and subscribers by reading YA, and you read nothing else. After a while, you're not going to be able to pick up Jeffrey Eugenides or Curtis Sittenfeld or anything like that. You're not going to be able to do it. You're going to read it and find it boring. And I have seen booktubers who are fully grown adults. They have the tobacco habits and the alcohol habits to prove it. They are fully grown adults. They talk about nothing but YA. They read nothing but YA. They anticipate eagerly nothing but YA. And I have seen them on their channel openly say that, first of all, classics, meaning anything written before 1900, are completely beyond the pale. They aren't even English. I don't even know what they are. I would never, ever, under any circumstances, read one. Not only that, but also that contemporary fiction written for their own age group, they find boring. And that's I won't be melodramatic and say that's a whole generation of readers that we're losing, because if there's one thing I've learned in my 28 years, it's the resiliency of the reading community. No fad ever kills it. No downward sales ever kill it. No easy way out. The easy way out never kills it. I don't have to worry about that. But I do worry about losing lots of people. We're losing lots of people. There are lots of, and also it comes back to wrath, because a lot of the people who are being gluttons and being slothful by concentrating only on this very easy, very simple genre that just gives them immediate feels and doesn't challenge them at all. And especially, and now with sensitivity coaches and whatnot, doesn't even show them anything that isn't a mirror image of themselves. Those people are tapping into wrath because they're turning the focus of the angle around to their teachers and saying, well, why should I read this? First of all, not because you say so, because if you say anything, if you try to assert any kind of authority over me, my parents will sue you. And they won't just sue you out of this job. They'll set up a computer program to make sure they can track you anywhere and cost you a job everywhere. You'll never work in your profession again if you try to exert any authority over me whatsoever. Not only that, but I know this firsthand, or secondhand rather, because I know people, teachers, who've had very smart students come up to them and say, so this thing we're reading, it's all cis? Well, an old friend of mine distinctly remembers the first time she was asked that question, it was just a few years ago. She had no idea what the student was even talking about. And when it was explained to her, she was flat out horrified. And she should be. And that's the horrible dark side of Sloth, which is the seventh of our seven deadly sins of YA here, is that Sloth in the 21st century is proactive. Not just in reading and not just in YA, but everywhere. In the 21st century now, you not only are unashamedly lazy, but you kind of want to legislate it. You kind of want to turn it around so that if your boss says, well, I know you're new here, but you had 35 reports to do and you did 15, your idea isn't, oh, geez, I'm sorry about that, I'll work harder tomorrow. It's, I only felt like doing 15. And if that's not okay with you, I'll sue. That's new. And that weaponizes Sloth, that's a rant for a whole nother time. So those are the seven deadly sins of YA, and they've been noticeable from the start. There's very smart YA being written. I praised it. I've made lists for it. I reviewed it. But as Miriam points out in her blog post, publishers have glutted the market with stuff they know will sell that isn't good. And I think that that stuff, of course, epitomizes the seven deadly sins. And I think that's why we're starting to see more and more booktubers pop up and say, this YA just isn't doing it for me anymore. I read a lot of it, and it just doesn't satisfy me the way it did. I think it's because they're in the confessional box right with me, and they're noticing these sins, and maybe starting to think, if I voyage elsewhere, I might encounter these sins, but maybe not in such incredibly high and toxic concentrations, and I think they're right. I think they're right. The ultimate takeaway that I want to do here, your penance, as it were. I want 25 Hail Marys. The takeaway that I want to do here is the same thing that I say on this channel all the time, which is that there's so much more to reading than the fields we know. Go out and find something new and read it. And you will find all of these seven deadly sins, but you'll find them in less concentration and aimed more at the top of your brain than the bottom of your brain, which is good. That's always healthy. So that's I wanted to make a response, because if Britt, of all people, the queen of the Raven Boys, if she can make a video saying that she's starting to lose interest in YA, then I believe a sea change is happening on BookTube, and I think it's really healthy. So I'm gonna leave it there, and I'll be back to chatting about books in no time. So thank you, BookTube.